So I saw this idea sketched out by Cambac in the Trench Blocks Discord server, and I decided to jump on it, proceeding to spend 9.5 hours over the next 2 days streaming and recording the process of turning it into a map. In this video, I'll document my process and decision making throughout the whole thing. The first step was to get some reference images together, various angles of the wall, towers, and surroundings in general. I look back at these at any time I was unsure what to build. Given the brief, I was going to need 2 mountainous areas for the corners, a ridgeline down the middle, and some lowland type terrain for the rest of the map area. Sometimes it's easiest or just best to make terrain from scratch, but in this example I had sort of imagined that I could combine several generated outputs from the genland filter and just smooth over the transitions between them later. So I started by looking for a corner area that I liked, after which I used Layer Mirror, the Box Select tool to select half the map, cut it to a new layer, and then used Layer Rotate and the Move tool to shift it in position in the opposite corner. I then needed to remove everything I didn't need from that generated layer. So for this, I enabled the Plane tool using /, positioned it near the bottom of the map using the left angle bracket to lower the plane in the scene. Right angle bracket would have raised it. I ensured snap mode is set only to plane, and then used a brush in subtract mode with origin at base and a very high Z size to then scrub out the bits I didn't want. Next up was the ridgeline, so back to Genland I went. I found a generation that had a fairly straight ridge. I used the Layer Wrap tool to move it upwards, which is only possible really due to Genland creating a seamless tiled output. After which I could then pretty much repeat the process of scrubbing out the sides, moving the bits I didn't want, and then use the Move tool to rotate it and position it in the center of the map. There was then one last trip into the Genland filter to create the lowland areas, which took a bit of tinkering to have a fairly flattish output with no rivers, but this step required no extra positioning. With all of these pieces generated and merged into one layer using the Merge Layer Down button, and liking what I saw, I then had the most time-consuming task of smoothing out the rough edges, of which there were many. I started by using just a large brush while in plane snap mode to just manually fill in areas from bottom to top, but I quickly switched into a kind of hybrid approach that still used the plane, but with a smaller brush size to draw like an outline on the terrain, and then the fill bucket to flood fill it for me. This overall process had 2 parts to it. Firstly, to iron out sort of erroneous edges and cliffs that the generation process had left in and my rough cutting had left as it was. And secondly, to extend the shape of the remaining blocks down into the surrounding areas. It was a bit of a vibes-based process, kind of looking at areas and editing them up and down until they felt okay. The main vibe being to take the contours of the hills that began higher up the mountain and sort of trickle them down into the lowlands below, and sometimes vice versa from the bottom going up. It's worth noting that every so often I'd hit the generate button on the terrain colouring effect to recolor the entire terrain layer based on its algorithm, which removed the need for me to pay attention to how things looked beyond just the shape of it all. And after doing that for a very long time, I found a good place to pause and moved on to creating the wall. So hold the phone here a minute. This is AOS 3B, the next version of Goxel beyond the one I was using to make this map. And I've just added a feature, and I'm going to try this again. I've had to recreate the exact same sort of scenario because I didn't have the early version of the file. And I've created this smoothing tool. Let's see how long it takes to smooth this terrain out and make it look nice. I mean, how much heavy lifting has that just done? Madness. Either way, if you're coming at this and you're on Goxel beyond version 3b, just use the smoothing tool. Referring back to the reference images for colour and scale hints, I then created a new layer, went into top-down camera view, set up a fairly large origin at base brush with colour and noise enabled, and this time I brushed with volume snap on so that it followed the height of the train underneath the cursor. With this shape in place, I then shuffled the entire layer down a couple of blocks and went around fixing the kind of unnatural looking contours that had been created on top. 2 block thick crenellations on the top also felt right. I then set to work creating a tower from the reference images, selected the layer, copied to placer, then placed them, after which I added the tops to the end ones. 3.5 hours in, this is where I stopped the first stream. Grandy from the future here. Later into the process, I realised that the 4 towers would actually be 2 sets of 2 towers, the end towers and the inner towers. The end towers would have the intel hut and a staircase going up from the base on one side, while the 2 sort of inner towers wouldn't have these. So to best model this, I ended up using the layer clone feature. I copied the original tower onto a new layer, added the hut on top, then cloned both layers twice and placed those clones into the original spots I had put the towers. This way, instead of 4 towers to edit later, I only had the 2 source towers to edit. If not for the staircases, I might have even been able to have a setup where the end towers had a clone of the other tower inside them and then an extra layer, and use that to clone, making only 1 tower effectively to edit. But anyway, going a bit too much in detail here. Earlier in the process, I saw a larger structure in the reference images, which later birthed into the idea of putting in a gatehouse, so that came next. Big brush for the initial shape, a few initial details, rotated it into place using the move tool. I then made a surface to extrude by cutting some blocks inwards with a subtract brush and the line tool, extruding 1 block down to remove the middle, and then extruding that whole surface down negatively into the structure. I could then tie it in with the walls by adding the doors, the windows, and then get to putting in some details. The first of which was a hole for the portcullis, which I initially put on the same floor as like the wall level, but soon decided to create a layer 1 beneath that level, add in winches and other details including a weapon rack, a toilet, and some bunk accommodation for the troops. I then received a suggestion from Influx with a reference image that had a kind of pagoda type structure sitting on top of the gatehouse, so I proceeded to create that. Holding shift whilst brushing to create lines, and I split the layers into various floors, and the outer poles were on their own layer as well, so I could hide them independently. I then fleshed out the middle layer of the gatehouse with a kind of mezzanine floor and other details, and a stairway up and all that. The vague plan from this point on was to add the roads, the village, the trees, and then revisit some of the terrain smoothing and add some more details to the wall. For the roads, I created a new layer, enabled the plane and plane snapping, moved the plane way up above the train, and then sketched out the shape using a small brush. I could then use the Plan Roads tool to generate roads without making edits directly to the train layer. The plan layer needed to be the currently selected layer, and then you select the terrain layer in the drop-down to use as a reference for the heights of the surface the road should be painted on. I edited this plan and the shape of where the road went several times over the course of creating the map, the first major edit being a road towards the base of the intel towers from spawn. It's worth noting that anytime I edited the terrain layer's shape, I needed to go and regenerate the road layer from the plan. This new road also meant the new staircase needed to be added to the end towers, as I mentioned earlier. From previous maps, I had various village-like buildings I could use. Houses, farms, pots, carts. I could just load them into the placer from File, rotate them, and place them on the map, which I did for both ends of the map. If you were working from scratch, you'd have to make these models yourself. You could either save your project, open a new one, and make the models in there, exporting each layer to either KVX or TXT to text, or you can make the model directly in your map's project file, box select it, copy it to Placer, and then use that. I would also advise you then export the Placer content to a new file, so that it becomes part of your Placer history and you don't have to keep reselecting it on the map to use it every time. I also, from previous maps, had various tree models that had been created and exported into separate files, so I used those in this map. However, to place them, while you could use the Placer tool, like I did for the village, here I employed a different tactic, the doodad placement tool. This takes in a list of models that you select from File, and it will automatically place them according to various rules. By default, the tool will use the combined surface from all layers in your map as a potential placement spot, but you can instead specify a layer to use. So I took a duplicate of my terrain layer, hacked it apart, removing all the areas that I did not want trees, so in the mountains, on the ridge where the wall was, on top of where the roads were, and inside the villages. I could then pick this layer in the drop-down, provide it with some tree models, and then get it to randomly place them in a new layer. I also ended up doing it a second time, but just with the bush models in a separate layer, just because I wanted more underbrush. With most map parts now being in place, I went roaming around, looking for things to improve, which ended up being nicer elevation changes on the roads, after which I had to regenerate the roads from the plan, adding a staircase up from the ground in the gatehouse, and added a lower room in there, adding details into the tower source layers that the clones then picked up, adding more details to the walls, like the trim, which off-stream I then expanded upon to give the walls more depth, and then used a very low opacity black and green paintbrush with some dithering and anti-alias to then weather the walls as if it had ivy or some cracks or whatever in it. 9.5 hours after starting the project, over the course of a couple of days, we ended up with this. I hope you enjoyed that little overview. And the making of the map. Just to close it out, I thought it would be worthwhile just going through the layers that I ended up having by the very end to show how these different map parts were split up at the end of the day. At the top we've got the wall ends, which were just these tiny little end pockets to close up the towers. We've got the village at each end, so we've got the village with all its pieces in it at that end, and same with the village at this end. We've got the wall itself with all of its parts, all of its texture on it. we've got the towers. So there's 4 different towers in here. 2 of them are clones of our tower model, which is that one over there. And then 2 of them are clones of our tower intel model, which is this one over here. We've then got Gatehouse. Gatehouse is comprised of many different layers. We've got the gates themselves at the bottom. Then objects is a various collection of different pieces inside. We've then got lower floor, which is sort of the bottom of the gatehouse going up to about there, but not including the floor level of the one above. You've then got middle floor, which is pieces going up into that middle area. Upper floor, which is just the roof parts here. And then you got the pagoda. The pagoda has different sections for the different pieces. So you got a lower section, you've got posts, you've got the roof all in there. From there, you've then just got a single layer for trees and a single layer for bushes. And of course the road plan, which is generated from our roads plan and the train layer. And that's it. The map is pretty much done. I've even gone through and had a look at where different pieces of metadata in terms of spawn areas, for the flags, for the players, for the ammo and stuff would end up on the map. So yeah. Until we see this in game, I guess that's it for the Great Wall.